A chance discovery by the roadside drew the sheriff into a deadly game. His enemies thought he was alone, but they didn't know who would emerge from the shadows with him. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the horizon, tinting the desert sky in faint shades of orange and pale pink. The air was still cool, though dry, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and sagebrush. Sheriff Eli Colton rode along the long border road, his horse's hooves striking a steady rhythm against the hardened earth. At 50 years of age, Eli was a man accustomed to long silences and the solitude of wide-open spaces. His weathered face carried the lines of years under the sun, and his eyes, calm but alert, moved constantly across the landscape. He had patrolled these trails for decades, knew each bend of the canyon, each cluster of mesquite, each rock formation along the road. Yet he also knew the desert had ways of hiding dangers, even in the most familiar places. Smugglers and raiders were always clever, always trying to find new ways to move their contraband without drawing attention. The sheriff's mind wandered to the town he had left behind just an hour earlier, a settlement clinging to the edge of civilization with its dusty main street, sagging porches, and the sound of hammers against lumber as men tried to keep their homes standing against the harsh winds. It was a town where everyone knew everyone else, where appearances mattered, where respectability was a currency as valuable as silver. Yet Eli had learned long ago that behind the neat fronts and polite smiles, corruption thrived. He had seen it grow like a shadow in the corners of power, whispered in saloons, exchanged through folded notes in the hands of merchants. He carried the weight of that knowledge silently, and this morning, as his horse trotted steadily beneath him, he felt the heavy truth pressing against him more than usual. The road stretched endlessly before him, an empty ribbon of dirt and gravel, bordered by scrub and the occasional twisted cedar. The sun was climbing higher, chasing away the last remnants of night, when something caught his attention. To the left of the road, half hidden by a tangle of dry brush, lay a shape too straight, too deliberate to be natural. Eli slowed his horse, eyes narrowing as he studied it from a distance. At first it looked like a bundle of supplies wrapped in cloth, maybe a broken wagon part left behind. But as he drew nearer, his instinct stirred. There was purpose in the way it was positioned, as though someone had taken the trouble to conceal it just enough to avoid notice, while ensuring it would remain intact. Eli dismounted, boots crunching softly against the gravel. His hand rested near the worn grip of the revolver at his hip, not out of panic, but out of habit. He approached cautiously, his eyes sweeping the ground. The shape was covered by a tarp, the kind of heavy canvas often used to shield wagons from the elements. Stones had been placed around the edges to hold it down against the wind. Kneeling, he tugged at one corner, and the tarp fell away with a sigh of dust. The sight beneath it stopped him cold. It was a coffin. It lay in the sand, as though it had been carried there only hours before. The wood was polished mahogany, rich and gleaming, untouched by the grit that coated every other surface in the desert. Golden-toned handles reflected the pale sunlight, and the trim along the sides shone as though it had been finished by a skilled craftsman just yesterday. Eli's heart beat slower, heavier. Coffins were symbols of grief and privacy. They belonged in churches, graveyards, or the hands of undertakers, not abandoned on the side of a desert road. He circled it slowly, studying every detail. The lid was sealed, not with the usual nails or discreet clasps, but with thick iron bands bolted crudely across the top. The edges bore the marks of a blacksmith's hammer. Whoever had done this had not cared for elegance, only strength. They had wanted this coffin closed so tightly that no curious hand might pry it open without effort. The sheriff straightened and scanned the surroundings again. There were tracks in the dirt, deep grooves left by wagon wheels, fresh imprints from horseshoes, boot marks pressed sharply into the soil. The tracks led from the road to the place where the coffin now rested and then stopped abruptly. It had been dragged or carried here deliberately. Eli crouched, touching the marks with his calloused fingers. The impressions were recent. Whatever had happened here, it had been during the night. For a long moment he stood over the coffin, listening. The desert was quiet, save for the whisper of the wind through brittle branches. His horse shifted nervously behind him, as though sensing the unnaturalness of the scene. Eli took a slow breath, drew out a small crowbar from his saddlebag, and returned to the coffin. He hesitated only briefly, then worked the metal between the iron bands and the edge of the lid. The metal groaned in protest, the sound harsh against the silence. With a final wrench, one of the bands snapped loose. The lid opened reluctantly, and Eli peered inside. The interior was lined with velvet of deep crimson, as pristine as the wood outside. But what lay within was not a body. Nestled in the folds were rows of rifles, gleaming steel barrels polished and oiled, stacked with precision. Beneath them lay revolvers, dozens of them, each carefully wrapped in cloth. Toward the bottom were wooden crates, stenciled with markings in black ink. Eli pried one open with the blade of his knife, and the sharp scent of powder struck his nostrils. Sticks of dynamite, bundled tightly together, lay within. He exhaled slowly, the realization sinking in. This was no accident, no ordinary smuggling run. This was a shipment of war. Among the weapons, something else caught his eye. A small bundle of papers tied with twine. He lifted it carefully, unfolding the sheets one by one. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. A ledger of sorts. Names filled the columns, some marked with symbols, others with amounts of money. Eli's brow furrowed as he recognized several of the names. Merchants he knew, respected townsfolk, even men who had shaken his hand in church on Sundays. And near the bottom, written boldly as though the writer had wanted to emphasize its importance, was the name of the deputy mayor. Eli's stomach tightened. The coffin had been no mere hiding place. It was a message and a shield, designed to move contraband under the cover of sanctity. No one questioned coffins. No one disturbed funerals. It was the perfect disguise. And now he, alone on this stretch of road, had stumbled onto its secret. The sheriff looked around once more, but the desert remained silent. He replaced the papers, though he kept them close to his chest, and closed the lid as best he could. He stood beside it, hands resting on his hips, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The sun was higher now, but the light felt dimmer, as though the world had darkened with what he had uncovered. His mind turned to the town again, to the faces of those he had seen listed on the paper. If even a fraction of it were true, the rot had spread deeper than he feared. And yet he knew one thing with certainty. Whatever lay behind this coffin, whoever had arranged its transport, they had not intended for it to be found. Eli mounted his horse once more, casting one last look at the polished wood gleaming unnaturally in the desert light. The road stretched ahead, but he no longer saw it as just another patrol. He carried with him now the weight of something vast and dangerous, something that would not stay buried. The discovery had marked him, had pulled him into a struggle far greater than he had expected when he left town that morning. As he turned his horse toward home, the coffin lay silent behind him, waiting, its secrets no longer fully its own. Eli rode on, the wind tugging at his coat, the dust swirling around him, and in his chest the heavy certainty grew stronger. His life had just crossed a threshold, and there would be no turning back. Eli Colton returned to town with the weight of the morning discovery heavy upon his shoulders. The ride back seemed longer than usual, though the sun was already climbing higher in the sky, and the desert was slowly surrendering its cool dawn air to the heat that would soon make the earth shimmer. His horse plodded faithfully along the trail, but Eli's mind was far from the rhythm of hoofbeats. The coffin, with its unnatural gleam and its iron-sealed lid, replayed in his thoughts again and again. The rifles, the revolvers, the dynamite, it was enough to arm a small army. And the names written in that ledger, the familiar handwriting that mapped out a network of trust turned to rot, unsettled him more than the weapons themselves. He had faced bandits before, smugglers and outlaws who hid their dealings in the wilderness. But this was different. This was organized. This was protected. And the knowledge that men he had once nodded to on Sunday mornings might be in league with the very forces that threatened his town stirred a coldness in him deeper than any desert night. As he neared the outskirts of the settlement, the sounds of life reached him, hammer blows against boards, the bark of a dog, the creak of wagon wheels. Yet even these simple noises seemed altered to him, carrying with them a tension he had not noticed before. He slowed his horse and passed the first few buildings. A pair of women stood by a well, drawing water and whispering to one another, their eyes flickering toward him with something sharper than curiosity. Across the street, a group of cowhands leaned against a railing, their laughter hollow, and when Eli passed, the sound faltered. A silence settled in his wake, and he felt it cling to him as though the dust itself had taken on suspicion. The sheriff dismounted in front of his office, tying his horse loosely to the post. Inside, the air was cool, shaded by the drawn blinds, but even here he felt no peace. He removed his hat, set it on the desk, and drew the small bundle of papers from his coat. He unfolded them once more, scanning the names. He traced the letters with his eyes, remembering each face that belonged to them. The blacksmith who had always been quick to offer a handshake, the shopkeeper who smiled as he counted out change, the deputy mayor whose speeches at town gatherings painted him as a guardian of order and prosperity. Now each name seemed to carry a hidden weight, as though every polite exchange had been nothing more than a mask. Eli folded the papers carefully, slipping them back into his inner pocket. He knew he could not share them, not yet. To walk into the council hall and present what he had found would be to place a target squarely on his own chest. He needed proof stronger than his word and a piece of paper. He needed allies who would not vanish when confronted with power. Yet in this town, surrounded by watchful eyes, he doubted whether such allies still existed. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and shadows stretched long over the dirt streets, Eli ventured out again. He walked slowly down the main street, hat pulled low, coat brushing against his boots. The saloon doors swung open to the sound of a piano, but the music faltered when he entered. Men at tables looked up, some raising glasses in greeting, others lowering their gazes quickly, too quickly. He felt the weight of their stares, the unspoken questions, the rumors already whispering. He ordered a drink but did not linger, preferring instead to step back into the cooling air of twilight. It was then he began to notice the shapes that moved with him. A man in a dust coat standing too long by a corner post, another crossing the street only to pause and watch from the shadows. When Eli turned his head, they shifted, casual in movement but purposeful in presence. The town was small enough that every new face was remembered, and these were not men he had seen before. They were watchers, silent and patient, waiting for him to slip. He returned home that night with their eyes still burning against his back. The house was dark and still when he entered, the air carrying the scent of old wood and the faint smoke of the lamp he lit. He set his revolver on the table within easy reach, then sat by the window, looking out into the quiet street. Hours passed, the night deepened, and still he sat. Near midnight, faint lights flickered at the edge of the yard. Torches. He rose, careful not to make a sound, and peered through the slats. Figures moved in the darkness. 3, maybe 4 of them, their shapes distorted by the glow of fire. They did not approach the house but lingered just beyond the fence, whispering in low tones. The torches illuminated the gleam of metal at one man's hip and the rough outline of another's hat pulled low. Eli's hand rested on the revolver, but he did not draw. Instead, he watched as they circled briefly and then melted back into the night, leaving behind only the faint smell of smoke and the knowledge that his movements were no longer his own. By morning, the unease had settled into his bones. He prepared his horse again, the papers hidden safely against his chest. As he rode out, the streets were already stirring with life, but the glances he received were sharper than before, the silences heavier. He knew then that the coffin had not gone unnoticed by those who had placed it. They were aware of his discovery. Perhaps they did not yet know how much he had seen or what he intended, but they were circling, probing, testing his resolve. The sheriff guided his horse toward the open road, away from the eyes of the town, and let the desert wind fill his lungs. His thoughts turned to one man who might still be trusted, a federal marshal, John Rivas, with whom he had once worked years ago during a violent chase after a smuggling ring. Rivas had been stern, methodical, a man who bent little to politics or charm. If anyone could be trusted to handle what Eli had uncovered, it was him. But reaching him would be no simple matter. Messages could be intercepted, riders could be followed. He would need to find a way to contact him without leaving a trail, to speak words that no one else could twist or silence. As the sun rose higher, Eli rode on, the heat pressing down against him, the weight of the discovery pressing heavier still. The town was no longer a sanctuary but a nest of shadows, and the faces of his neighbors were no longer familiar but veiled. Each glance felt like a test, each word spoken like a measurement. He understood then that the battle had already begun, even before the first shot was fired. The coffin had opened not only to reveal contraband, but to strip away the illusions that had cloaked his home. That evening, when he returned once more to the quiet of his office, he lit a lamp and placed the papers before him again. The ink shimmered faintly in the yellow light. The names seemed darker now, their weight undeniable. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the creak of the building as the night settled in around him. The decision formed slowly but firmly in his mind. He would not turn to the council, nor to the deputies who served under him. He would reach outside to someone untouched by the corruption that had rooted itself here. He would find a way to contact Rivas. Beyond the window, the town lay still under a star-strewn sky, but Eli knew that in its shadows, the watchers were still there. They had tested his silence once. They would test it again, but he would not be cowed. He was the sheriff, and though the law around him was beginning to crumble, he would not. And so, with the papers hidden once more against his chest and the revolver resting heavy at his side, he prepared himself for the days ahead, for the knowledge that danger had already taken hold, and that the quiet of his patrols was now gone forever. The desert was not silent anymore. It whispered with suspicion, it watched with shadows, and it waited for him to falter. Eli Colton would not give it that satisfaction. The following day dawned heavy with heat, the kind of weight that pressed on the skin even before the sun had reached its full strength. Eli Colton had slept little the night before. The faces of the men he had glimpsed at the edge of his property, the whispers carried on the smoke of their torches, still lingered in his mind like the embers of a fire refusing to die. He rose from his narrow bed with the knowledge that the quiet rhythm of his duties was gone. Each hour now carried a weight. Each movement needed care. He saddled his horse in silence, his revolver secured at his side, the bundle of papers tucked once more against his chest. His eyes traced the horizon, searching for movement, before he set out toward the desert once again. He had no choice but to return to the place where it had begun. The coffin had not left his thoughts since the moment he had pried it open, and though every instinct told him danger awaited, something deeper told him he needed to see it once more, to confirm whether it remained or whether those who had placed it had reclaimed their secret. The trail stretched long and lonely, the morning sun already casting its harsh glare across the stones and brush. Eli rode with his shoulders tense, his gaze never lingering too long on one patch of land, always shifting, always measuring. He passed the dried remains of a creek bed, the twisted branches of mesquite reaching like claws toward the sky, and finally came upon the familiar stretch of road where the coffin had rested. He slowed his horse, his breath catching slightly as the scene unfolded before him. The coffin was gone. The ground where it had lain bore scars of disturbance. The soil was torn with fresh ruts, deep grooves left by wagon wheels that had dug into the earth with their weight. The bushes nearby were crushed, their branches broken more violently than before. Someone had come, and they had not cared for subtlety. They had worked quickly, dragging the heavy load back to a waiting wagon and vanishing into the night. Eli dismounted, crouching low to the dirt. His hand brushed across the impressions, and he could feel the sharpness of them, the crisp edges that told him they were recent, no more than a few hours old. He rose slowly, his jaw tightening. He was not alone in his knowledge now. The men behind the coffin had realized their secret was at risk, and they had moved to secure it. A sound stirred the stillness. Eli's head lifted, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his revolver. From the line of trees that fringed the road, 3 figures emerged. They walked with a purpose that needed no words. Their faces were hidden beneath masks, rough cloth pulled tight to obscure their features. But the way they carried themselves told Eli all he needed. They were here for him. One bore a rifle slung across his chest, the other a shotgun cut down for close work, and the third gripped a length of iron pipe that glinted dully in the light. They spread out slightly, advancing with the confidence of men who believed the ground already belonged to them. Eli stepped back toward his horse, his body angling to use it for cover. His voice carried across the road, sharp with authority, commanding them to stop, though he knew before the words left his lips they would not obey. The man with the pipe broke into a run, boots pounding against the earth, his weapon raised high. The thunder of the shotgun shattered the morning silence. Pellets tore into the side of Eli's saddle, splintering leather and wood, the metallic ring of impact echoing in his ears. Instinct took hold. He dropped low, rolling to the opposite side of the horse, drawing his revolver as he moved. 2 shots cracked through the air, aimed not to kill but to force them into hesitation. The masked men ducked behind the scrub, the ambush turning into a deadly dance of cover and return. Eli's heart hammered, not with fear but with the steady rhythm of survival. He knew he could not hold his ground. There were 3 of them, perhaps more hidden beyond the tree line, and he had no advantage in numbers. His only chance was escape. He moved quickly, grabbing the reins, swinging into the saddle even as another shot roared past, the pellets whistling by his ear. The horse leapt forward, hooves striking sparks from stone, and Eli urged it hard down the road, his body pressed low against its neck. The sound of pursuit followed almost at once. From the brush came the creak of wheels, the crack of a whip, and the grind of wood against dirt. A wagon burst into the open, drawn by 2 strong horses, carrying more masked men. Dust rose thick in the air as they gave chase, the rattle of weapons audible even above the pounding hooves. Eli pushed his horse harder, weaving across the road to make himself a more difficult target. The sun burned against his back, and the desert stretched before him in an endless line of escape and danger. Shots rang out behind him, the bullets striking the dirt close enough to spray his boots with grit. He guided his horse sharply to the right, cutting across a low ridge, then plunging into a narrow ravine where the ground fell away into the cracked bed of a long, dry stream. The horse stumbled slightly on the uneven stones, but kept its stride, and Eli pressed forward, knowing the wagon would struggle to follow in such terrain. The shouts of his pursuers echoed faintly off the canyon walls, mingled with the groan of wheels forcing their way across ground not meant for them. For a moment they drew close again, their silhouettes visible at the crest of the ridge, but each twist of the ravine bought Eli another heartbeat of distance. At last the stream bed branched, splitting into 2 paths. Eli chose the narrower, guiding his horse through the tighter channel, where the rocks jutted higher and the shadows ran deeper. The wagon faltered behind him, its wheels striking hard against stone, its progress slowing. He did not stop to look back. He climbed the rise at the end of the ravine, emerging onto a cracked service road that stretched in pale emptiness toward the horizon. There he pulled hard on the reins, bringing his horse to a halt behind the shelter of a rusted water trough left long abandoned. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, his revolver still steady in his hand, his ears straining for the sounds of pursuit. But the canyon behind him had grown quiet. The growl of the wagon's wheels had faded into silence, and the shouts of the men no longer carried through the air. For the moment he was alone. Eli dismounted, leading his horse into the shade of the trough, his eyes never leaving the road. The desert was still, but it no longer felt empty. The ambush had been too deliberate, too exact in its timing. They had known he would return to the place of the coffin. They had anticipated his steps as though his thoughts had been laid bare. That meant they were closer than he had believed, watching him more carefully than he had guessed. And if they were willing to fire on him in broad daylight, on a road any traveler might wander, then they were desperate. Desperation made men reckless, and recklessness made them dangerous in ways that left no room for error. He mounted again, guiding his horse at a slower pace along the service road, his thoughts heavy and sharp. He had survived the ambush, but survival was no longer enough. The men behind the coffin were not a band of opportunists. They were an organization with reach, with resources, and with orders to silence him before he could carry what he knew any further. Each moment he delayed, each turn he made, brought the danger closer. By the time the sun began its descent and the long shadows stretched once more across the land, Eli knew that what he had faced that morning was not the end, but only the beginning. They had tested his resolve, and he had escaped. Next time they would not make the mistake of underestimating him. He turned his horse toward the distant line of hills, his eyes fixed on the road that led beyond them. His mind returned to the single name he still believed he could trust. If he was to survive, if he was to strike back against the darkness that had crept into his town, he would need the help of someone who stood outside its walls. He would need the marshal. The desert swallowed the hoofbeats as he rode on, leaving behind the dust and silence of the ambush. The air felt heavier, as though the land itself bore witness to the blood that had almost been spilled. Eli rode into the gathering twilight with the knowledge that the lines had been drawn, and that by prying open the coffin on that lonely morning, he had stepped irrevocably into a war he could not yet see the end of. The night after the ambush weighed heavily on Eli Colton's mind. He had escaped, but survival in the desert was never a victory, only a reprieve. The attack had been no random encounter, no chance clash with wandering outlaws. It had been prepared, timed, and executed with the confidence of men certain their quarry would come. The coffin had been removed, its deadly cargo reclaimed, and those who had left it behind had been willing to risk blood on the open road to silence him. As Eli returned from the service road toward the town, the stars spread above him like countless watchful eyes. He realized that every step he had taken since the morning he found the coffin had led him deeper into a snare. The shadows around him were no longer distant. They pressed close, and their reach stretched into every corner of his life. By the time he dismounted in front of his home, the night was deep, the lamps along the main street glowing dimly. He did not sleep, could not allow himself that indulgence. His revolver rested within arm's reach, and his ears strained at every sound the wind carried. When the morning came at last, breaking over the town with pale light and the restless cries of crows, Eli saddled his horse and made his way to the far edge of the county where the land rolled into barren flats. It was there that he found the man he had trusted in years past, the federal marshal John Rivas, summoned through careful word and old bonds. Their meeting was brief, the words exchanged as spare and hardened as the desert stone around them. Eli told him what he had seen: the weapons, the dynamite, the ledger with names that should have been above reproach. Rivas's jaw tightened as he listened, his silence heavier than any oath. He did not question Eli's story, nor did he feign surprise. He understood the scale, perhaps even better than Eli did. Together they formed a plan, swift and without embellishment. If the men behind the coffin believed their shipment safe, they would be tempted by another. A bait would be prepared, a coffin that looked identical to the first, filled not with rifles and powder, but with emptiness, meant only to draw out the hands that grasped in the shadows. The place chosen was an old freight yard at the edge of the county, a tangle of abandoned tracks and rusting sheds, a place once busy with commerce, but now left to silence and dust. It could be secured, watched, and controlled, the perfect stage for truth to step into the light. The preparation was carried out with a precision that steadied Eli's heart. He stood in the freight yard at dusk, watching the unmarked wagons roll into place, the plain-clothed men of the marshal's force taking up positions in silence. The coffin sat in the back of a modest delivery wagon, its surface polished to perfection, its hinges scarred with crude welds that mimicked the original. When Eli laid his hand upon it, the wood felt cold beneath his palm, the memory of the first coffin flashing in his mind. He thought of the weapons hidden in velvet, of the acrid scent of powder, of the list of names. He thought of the men who had hunted him, their masked faces and merciless weapons. This coffin was different, but it carried the same weight, the same promise of revelation. Night fell quickly, the yard swallowed in long shadows broken only by the pale cones of light from a few aging lamps. Eli moved among the rusting cargo crates and broken wagons, his presence quiet but resolute. His eyes swept the entrance, the sagging chain-link fence beyond, where the road disappeared into darkness. The air was cool now, touched by the faint smell of oil and old iron, the scent of a place once full of life, but now waiting only for ghosts. He knew that the men he sought would come. They could not resist. The loss of the first coffin had left them desperate, and desperation was a hunger that always returned to feed. It was just after 9 when headlights pierced the distance. Eli tensed, his hand brushing the grip of his revolver, his breath measured. A dark wagon rolled to a stop outside the gate, its wheels crunching softly against gravel. For a moment it lingered there, its engine growling low, before the gate creaked open and it slipped inside. Another followed, and then a third, larger, its presence heavy, commanding. Eli watched as men emerged, their shapes moving with the assurance of those accustomed to command. They did not shuffle like common thieves, nor did they glance nervously at shadows. They walked as though the ground was theirs, their posture calm, their eyes sharp. One man in particular drew Eli's attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the gait of authority, he stepped forward toward the coffin. Even in the dim light, Eli recognized him. Deputy Mayor Lawson, a man whose name had graced speeches of justice, whose handshake had carried the weight of respect. He had been a pillar of the community, or so it had seemed. Now, with his hand resting casually on the coffin's lid, he revealed himself for what he truly was. Eli's chest tightened, but his expression remained hard. Here was the confirmation that the corruption he feared had seeped into the very bones of the town's leadership. The driver of the delivery wagon moved as instructed, swinging open the back doors to reveal the coffin. Lawson exchanged a few quiet words with one of his men, then leaned closer to inspect the iron-bound box. In that instant the signal came, sharp and clear through the air. Floodlights blazed to life, casting the yard in harsh brilliance, shadows vanishing beneath the weight of light. From every angle, federal agents stepped forward. Weapons drawn, their voices cutting through the night with commands that echoed off the walls. The men who had entered so confidently froze, caught in the circle of law they had thought themselves immune to. For a heartbeat, silence held them all. Eli watched Lawson, his face lit in stark relief, his jaw clenched, his eyes unblinking. There was no fear there, only cold calculation, as though he were already considering how to twist this moment to his advantage. Then one of the lesser men panicked, bolting toward the far fence. The crack of gunfire split the air, agents shouting, chaos unfolding. Lawson raised his hands slowly, the weight of inevitability pressing down upon him, but the defiance in his stance remained. He was a man unmasked, but unbroken, and Eli knew this arrest would not end the fight. By the time the yard had quieted, 3 wagons and a truck lay in federal hands, their occupants bound and watched. Crates had been seized, weapons cataloged, ledgers pulled from hidden compartments. It should have felt like a triumph, a clean strike against the rot that had spread unseen. But Eli's heart knew better. This was one victory in a war that had only begun. The network stretched beyond this yard, beyond Lawson, beyond the men who now sat in chains. It wove through towns and counties, perhaps even through the very institutions meant to guard against such corruption. The fight would not end here. Rivas approached, his face grave but not without satisfaction. He spoke in a low voice, reminding Eli that tonight would not be forgotten. It would make headlines by morning, shake the confidence of men who thought themselves untouchable. Yet even as the agents began loading prisoners into wagons, Eli's eyes remained fixed on Lawson, the once respected deputy mayor now reduced to a captive, his fine coat dusty, his hands bound. The image was stark, but it was not enough to quiet the storm brewing in Eli's mind. As the last of the suspects were taken away, the freight yard fell into silence once more. The empty coffin sat in the back of the wagon, its polished surface reflecting the artificial light. Eli stood before it, remembering the first coffin he had found by the roadside, the one that had carried not only weapons but a message. That one had been reclaimed, its trail obscured, but its shadow remained. He thought of the names still hidden, the men still free, the unseen hands that had orchestrated it all. The work ahead would be harder, more dangerous, and it would demand more than vigilance, it would demand sacrifice. When he finally climbed into his saddle, the yard shrinking behind him, Eli rode slowly into the night. The cool wind brushed against his face, the darkness wrapping around him once more. He carried no illusions of peace, no belief that the battle had ended. The coffin had been meant to bury secrets, but instead it had unearthed them. And now that those secrets had seen the light, Eli knew he would spend the rest of his days ensuring they did not slip back into the shadows. The town he had once thought of as home was not the same, and neither was he. The discovery had marked him, had carved a line between the world before and the world after. Ahead lay danger, betrayal, and the long shadow of corruption. But as his horse carried him steadily along the road, Eli Colton's resolve burned with the certainty of a man who had chosen his path and would not turn back. The Coffin's secret belonged to him now, and with it came the promise of a war he would fight to his final breath. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you won't miss the next chapters. Check out our other videos for more adventures and share this one with your friends to spread the story.